Good afternoon, everyone. Can I ask everyone to try to get their coffee and sit down, please? Take their seats so we can begin. This is yours, right? If I could encourage everyone to get coffee and come on and get seated. And as is, you know, at the front row, because you will be called on. Okay, Mary, we'll let you sit in the front. Come on. Come on, come on. Okay, I hope everyone can find their seats, and we have plenty of room up in the front row for the bold among you. Welcome, everyone. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the 25th anniversary celebration speaker series. This is a time where we reflect on what we have accomplished as an institution and celebrate our accomplishments in so many areas, and at the same time look to the future. And the best way to do that kind of self-reflection and prediction about the future is to hear from the folks who are making that future and who have been so instrumental in how we've gotten where we are and where we're going to get to in the future. So it has been a real pleasure to welcome the speakers in our series. And this afternoon, we have a very, very unique and special honor to be able to welcome Dr. Stephen Galson, a dear friend and colleague, and a member. I believe we can read his resume, but I don't know if it says the highest accomplishment is a member of the board of trustees of Tech. Right? Yeah, yeah, like that. That's the one. Uh, but as you know from Steve's well-known bio, he was the Surgeon General of the United States for several years, head of CDER at the FDA, a member of CDC and the Department of Health and Human Services. What I don't think comes through from reading Dr. Galson's resume is his incredible dedication to public health and public service. Stephen was an officer in the Public Health Service, retired as an admiral. You're at, yeah, whatever. Uh, And what he does not remember, by the way, is I introduced Stephen back in some early day at Amgen to an alumni event, and when I introduced him as admiral, my first question was, "Do you have a sword in that big hat?" And he does, but he didn't bring it. No sword. Anyway, but I want to spend just a second talking about Dr. Galson's incredible accomplishment and leadership, and again, how he has been able to use his education and training, his MD, his public health training, but most profoundly, his dedication to making the world a better place and a healthier place. As Surgeon General, he pushed forward so many changes and developments in the public health service. Some of you may remember a little storm that hit the town of New Orleans called Katrina, and it was because of Stephen's work and his leadership of the public health service that 1,000 public health officers were able to go there and provide public health services to those incredibly needy kinds of folks. In addition, Stephen also led the effort in the Department of HHS in childhood obesity, in fighting childhood obesity. And it still remains today as a hallmark of what the department is doing and has done. And I don't think there's anyone here who doesn't understand or realize how severe a problem it is and how urgent it is that we deal with that as a public health issue. Um, in addition, he was the first to sort of jumpstart efforts in the HHS to reduce incidents of preterm births in 2008. Again, that effort remains focused and functioning, and has helped save lives of mothers and babies to this very day. I could go on about Dr. Galson's accomplishments, but I'd like to hear them from him because it's probably the truth. But I do want to also say that Stephen is also a dear friend, and it is a real pleasure to have Stephen and Jesse because I know it's a team sport. So it's a pleasure to have both of you today, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you, Stephen.
Thank you. Well, it is great to be here, and there were some exaggerations in there, but I won't spend my precious time correcting you. But first, I want to thank Shelley, the Board of Trustees, my fellow board members, the faculty, the staff, and the supporters of KGI for making this anniversary speaker series a reality. Of course, a huge thanks to my wife, Jessie, who has tolerated me not just for the past 40 years, but particularly over the last few weeks as I prepared this talk. It's now, as you heard, it's the 21st anniversary, and 25 years is a very good time to step back, pause, reflect, evaluate the best path forward, and rededicate ourselves to the mission of this institution. And I'm really very, very honored to be part of this. So um, I wanted to do some disclosures. If I can move the slide up. This is not working. Okay, so um, I'm on the board of several biopharmaceutical companies. I'm a senior advisor to the global management consulting firm, the Boston Consulting Group, um, and I'm on a public-private partnership between Duke and FDA, on focused on improving clinical trials. Next slide. Um, and I worked for those public agencies and a private company, Amgen, the New York State Health Department as well. And I think I've worked for enough different organizations that all my many biases cancel each other out. But you can tell me at the end of this if you agree with that. I do want audience participation. So um, store up any questions that you have, and I think I'll talk for about 40 minutes. There should be a little bit of time at the end. But if you don't ask questions, I'm going to start asking you questions. And I'm going to start with the students. I like to pick on the person who's trying to hide. The last person in the last row, that's who I would start with. So if you don't ask questions, that poor guy is going to be in trouble. So I wanted to start and tell you a little bit about my professional journey. As you've heard, spent 23 years as an officer in the U.S. Public Health Service. I worked in several different parts of the government, working on problems like occupational health and safety, evaluating pesticide levels in food supply, childhood obesity. But the biggest acute health challenge that the country has ever faced, COVID-19, arose about a decade after I left the government. So in January 2020, when COVID hit, I was the senior vice president at Amgen, which is just down the road about 75 miles, leading the global regulatory affairs and safety group. And with my public health background, the CEO asked me to lead the company's COVID response leadership group. And this Amgen has staff in about 50 countries around the world. So it's fair to say that at that point, my professional life took a very sharp pivot towards COVID, and I helped lead the company to face this. It was really an existential threat, not just for people around the world, but for a lot of companies. The first challenge that we had was how to keep the manufacturing system going so that patient drug supply wasn't impacted. And with all the focus on healthcare workers, a lot of people don't pay enough attention to frontline workers, not in direct patient care. But the people manufacturing medical products around the world are heroes, just like the doctors and the nurses. We had to set up a system to keep thousands of these workers on multiple continents in their facilities in person, despite the worsening pandemic. We had to set up testing facilities, staffing policies for people who became infected outside of work. Workflows were modified to reduce congestion of staff together, which you can imagine in a manufacturing facility is really very difficult to do. Availability of testing at that point early on was variable in different parts of the world, as were the national COVID policies. So all this had to be considered while we had to keep a high level of protection for the staff. And I know the work that Amgen did was replicated in many, many companies around the world who had to organize large workshops, for example, to manufacture vaccines and more tests and those antiviral drugs. And one thing I want to note is that among those workers at Amgen and other companies were KGI grads. They were here, they're employed by those companies. And so I wanted to just take a second and pause. And hopefully some of these people I'm talking about are either here today or listening online and have a round of thanks for those manufacturing workers during COVID. They helped us a lot. When I think back to those days, I'm proud I was able to do my part to keep Amgen's products flowing to patients in need. But the intense work of people in public health and in the medical product communities really, I think, will stand when we look back as an incredible example for the future. But we're not really far enough away from the pandemic, in my view, to fully judge our performance. So epidemiologists, policy analysis, and others, you're going to have a lot of career opportunities over the next few years, looking back and seeing how we performed in COVID. People are trying already to evaluate performance in many sectors. And that makes excellent sense because uh, the pandemic could get worse. We haven't totally thrown it off. So I thought I would spend when Shelley asked me to do this most of my time talking about the pandemic. This crowd looks pretty calm and collected, but when I talk to family members, former colleagues, and friends, there's still a fair amount of anxiety, I think, about COVID-19. Who's anxious in this room or concerned about it? I know there are a few of you, even if you don't want to raise your hand. The virus has surprised us, as you know, multiple times with its mutations that have influenced either the severity of the disease or the infectiousness, and we can't be sure that it won't get worse. However, mental health professionals say if you're anxious about something, talk about it. So that's really what I'm going to do for most of this talk. Um, we're sick and tired of hearing about COVID, and that's why I'm going to continue to talk about it. If you could show the next slide. Um, this is a little hard for you to see, but this is a slide I captured from the CDC tracking website just last week. And as you can see, the trend for cases and hospitalization continue to go down. Just look at January through now. The low update booster vaccination rates that are outlined in red should concern us a lot because the causes of this are very multifactorial. Some people still don't trust the government recommendations to get vaccinated. It's hard for me to understand that myself, considering the strong data vaccine reduces serious illness and death, which I'm going to show you in a second. But the low rates may also be a reflection of disparities in healthcare access. I have a choice of at least 10 cities within a short drive of my house. Many people, particularly those who live in less advantaged neighborhoods, those with disabilities, and the elderly have real access issues to face to get vaccinated. And as you see in the bottom row, and I know you know that this number already, more than 1 million people in the US have died from COVID-19 and about more than 7 million around the world. The next slide is just one way to look at the data on vaccine effectiveness. This is also from CDC. The top line in black is the deaths per 100,000 people from COVID over time. It covers the period just starting from May 2022 until now. The two bottom lines show the reduction in deaths among the vaccinated, and with the lowest line being the greatest reduction. And the lowest line corresponds to those individuals who had the updated bivalent booster. So the population receiving the updated booster have almost twice the reduction in deaths compared to vaccinated individuals who haven't had this updated booster. So go back and get vaccinated with the latest booster if you haven't already. Let me go back to the more than million deaths that I mentioned. I can't talk about the million people that have died without saying that the death rates have been highest among members of racial and ethnic minority groups in the United States, highlighting the chronic disparities that we have in healthcare access and that many Americans face, as I mentioned. These disparities exist despite many efforts to try to reduce them, and related to the middling job that we've done as a country to level healthcare disparities is the job that we've done to try to improve the diversity of the healthcare workforce. A recent UCLA study shows that the proportion of Black men in the physician workforce has not changed in the United States since 1940. So same proportion since 1940. The KGI Masters of Science in Community Medicine, which is designed to bring diverse candidates into the health professions for underserved LA area communities, one of the many efforts around the country to improve the diversity of the medical professions. And I've been proud to be part of that effort to get this program started. And I want to thank representatives from LA Care who are here, who also have been huge supporters for this program. Thanks to Shelley's leadership and that of our founding dean, David Lawrence, who was one of the earlier speakers in this series. The program is off and running, and I hope some of the students are with us today. I met at least one. Yay, okay, let's hear it for the. What many people don't realize is that the public health toll of the pandemic extended way beyond those getting ill with the virus. The toll on mental health has been discussed widely in the media, and I know you're all aware of it. Perhaps less well known are the significant increases in alcohol-related medical problems and their large toll on both patients and families. In the cancer area, careful studies have shown that a decrease in cervical cancer screening during the pandemic, presumably related to all those cancer physician visits, has resulted in an increased diagnosis of late stage cervical cancer in the group that was studied. In the prostate cancer area, decreases in screening have also resulted in an increase in late stage radiotherapy treatment for prostate cancer that's been well documented. There were also impacts that all of you probably know from your grocery store chain during COVID-19 on the food supply. What you probably haven't seen is that those impacts were actually a lot worse in lower and middle income countries than they were in the United States. So the wide and deep toll from the pandemic should be an additional wake-up call for us all about the need for innovative ways to level the socioeconomic, racial, and ethnic discrepancies in health in the United States. And I hope that's one of my take-home messages. Now I want to wade into some debates. There's a lot of debates going around about COVID, about why we didn't do better protecting our population from the ravages of the pandemic. Shelley, you didn't allow anybody to bring in rotten fruit or pies or anything like that. Okay, you screened them out. So next slide, sorry there. So the first is coordination. Some academic authors have pointed to a lack of coordination between our public health system and our healthcare system as a serious problem that was made worse during COVID. But before we can even broach that topic, it's important to keep in mind that we actually don't have a coordinated public health system or a coordinated medical care system in the United States. What we have is an aggregation of many different healthcare and public health providers. Some of those are systems like Kaiser or the LA public health system that runs the hospitals. All these disparate systems provide care, but the care is very, very different depending on where you live, your income level, your type of insurance, and other factors. Payers of these services will authorize one drug in one system and not authorize it in another system. One may let you go to the emergency room and the other doesn't. In the public health world, some jurisdictions like LA County have a robust, active, decently funded public health department, but other jurisdictions around the country have weak or underfunded and poorly staffed public health departments. So it really shouldn't have come as any surprise that we would have coordination problems in a country like the US, which is very complicated. Face it, we have a highly fragmented, non-systemic approach to healthcare and public health in the US in 2023. That's why I, looking at how we performed, tend to be on the side of giving thanks to what went well, and a lot did, like the rapid development of vaccines, rather than trying to clobber ourselves and our institutions about what went wrong. The type of fragmentation in our US healthcare system tends to favor chaos, like when we have large scale multi system disasters like Hurricane Katrina or the pandemic. None of this is to say that I think we should accept the chaos. I strongly support investments to help us do better next time around. But the expectation, for example, that the federal government has the authority and the resources to make a pandemic a walk in the park is just not realistic. So, moving on to the next topic, our state of preparedness. During my period in the government, as you heard, which included the 9/11 and subsequent anthrax attack, the H1N1 pandemic, pandemic planning became a buzzword and a source of billions of dollars distributed to federal, state, and local agencies. I was involved in multiple pandemic planning exercises during that time. Policies were written, scenarios were rehearsed, medication and other supplies were stockpiled. HHS created health services in Washington, an office of public health response with a new assistant secretary. There were congressional hearings and scientific reviews and reports about how we need to be prepared. It's fair to say that the vast majority of these planning exercises did not anticipate anything of the magnitude and complexity of the COVID-19 pandemic. Probably know that already. Our stockpiled masks ran out in a very short period of time, for example. And it goes without saying we weren't adequately prepared. But as I said, I'm less inclined to point a finger than to try to figure out how we can do better next time. I doubt there are any of the many participants in pandemic response at all the levels of government, in local hospitals, other healthcare systems that would not make improvements in their response and are not now working on trying to figure out how they can improve. And that's really, really very important. And it's also important, I think, for the federal government to lead and improve national preparedness programs. But they're going to need the support of Congress to get there. So, do other countries do better? Sometimes our pride in being the best in the world in many areas prevents us from learning from the experience of other countries. But some other countries did better than we did, judged by our per capita death rates. That said, we still do not understand all the causes of the geographic variation between countries with COVID, but we do know that the proportional death rates from the pandemic were higher in many high-income countries, for example, the United States and Italy, than they were in lower-income countries, even when the accuracy of this data is factored in. We also know that in the income countries where COVID mortality has been the highest, like the US, older age groups make up a larger share of the population than in countries like India. Countries with older populations also tend to have a greater prevalence of chronic health conditions like obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, chronic kidney disease, and respiratory illness. If we could lower the prevalence of these health conditions through better access to healthcare, better therapeutics, and more physical activity, it's likely that the mortality in this country and in future pandemics, if they occur, will be reduced. But we also know that there were differences between countries in the effectiveness of coordination of their healthcare systems and public trust, in particular, in government and institutions. Research has shown that protective behaviors like hand washing and mask wearing are related to our trust in institutions. In countries where trust in institutions is high, citizens are more likely to follow government recommendations. And let me just pause and say, in the US, we're not at the top of the trust scale compared to other countries. Hopefully that's not a big surprise. On testing, much has been written about the impact of a national COVID-19 testing strategy and other early testing problems. I know that our public health laboratories and CDC are hard at work at improving preparedness in this realm, and it's critically important. I want to talk for a minute about emergency powers, another area that needs full attention and reexamination, particularly in light of recent political events, are laws relating to public health emergency powers given to federal, state, and local agencies. Having worked directly and successfully with both of our major political parties, I'm loath to wade into any particular partisan topics here, but about a few things I can't really resist. The first is related to the action taken by states, some states, and statements by members of Congress to weaken the public health emergency powers that currently reside either with CDC or state or local health departments. Moving these powers, such as quarantine, masking, or congregation orders that help control the pandemic from the hands of public health authorities to politicians is anti-science and it's dangerous. Should we have a worsening of COVID or in future pandemics, terrorist attacks, or serious health challenges, I'm concerned that these moves could backfire. The executive branch can always override the decisions of public health authorities under their purview, but taking away a particular tool of authorities like masking orders is not going to help in a severe emergency. The built-in checks and balances in our system, including judicial review, have by and large functioned well in the pandemic. Scientific evidence is always evolving. And to me, the question is this: do we trust our scientists and experts with keeping up with the latest scientific data, or would we prefer politicians play that role? I'm not taking a poll now, but you can tell me later. I wanted to put the next slide up just as a quick backdrop. It would be funny if it wasn't so serious. There remains a great deal of disagreement about how best to prepare for the next pandemic. These disagreements are between experts on the same topic, of course, but the underlying tension between experts and politicians, it really seems worse than it has in my experience in government. The only way out of these disagreements is continue the dialogue and invest in research and policy analysis that provides more data. More data won't necessarily end the disagreements, but it could create more of a consensus view around some of the key issues. I see key roles for convening bodies like the national academies, other consensus-seeking groups and scientific organizations to establish a path forward for better responses. As scientists, we have to try to avoid the balkanization, what I'm calling the balkanization of expertise. By this, I mean many of the unanswered questions around how to manage a pandemic require interdisciplinary science and expertise covering multiple areas. For example, and this is a real example, if you ask someone who is an expert in how to model diseases and pandemic, the best way to prevent population spread of a novel virus, they may tell you close daycare centers and the schools, and keep them closed until the pandemic subsides, because these little kids, under their cuteness, they're fearsome disease vectors. And I can say this with confidence because the last time I was infected with COVID was by my grandson. But if you ask an educator or a child psychologist or a parent, and I know there are parents in the room, about the same question, they'll say, do everything in your power to stop virus transmission. But whatever you do, don't close schools for an extended time period because of the long-term damage it can cause to childhood development. So this very real tension can only be resolved through scientific research, policy analysis, and discussion that's multidisciplinary in nature. You can't just listen to one group or the other. For example, protocols for the shortest possible school closures could be developed in an infectious disease emergencies in a process involving parents and educators that highly values the best interest of students. In the vaccine area, we now know that we have the scientific expertise to rapidly produce a highly effective vaccine against a quickly maneuvering virus. So bravo again to those vaccine developers. But the bad news is we have not solved the problem of how to get these vaccines equitably distributed in the United States, much less the world. Again, the problem of how to vaccinate the world against the next pandemic is going to require multidisciplinary research, analysis, and implementation involving social and behavioral scientists, regulatory experts, supply chain experts, and others, along with those experts at making vaccines fast. Another example that I've noticed in the literature is indoor air quality. Most recommendations say more fresh outdoor air are needed inside buildings to reduce transmission. But these goals fly in the face of energy conservation and global warming requirements to make buildings more energy efficient. Only architects and engineers working with epidemiologists and vaccine experts will solve this problem. I want to talk for a minute about crisis communication and how, I think you can move it to the next slide, which is just blank, how the US public was kept informed about the pandemic and public health recommendations. It's become clear now, with a little bit of distance, that CDC's crisis communication experts were blocked from doing their job by the White House at critical times in the pandemic. So the agency of the government that's funded and trained to keep the public informed about times like this, the CDC is not allowed to do their job. Luckily, closer to home, LA County's public health director, Barbara Ferrar, has done a great job of keeping the public informed, and my hat's off to her. I'm a big fan of her weekly public radio interviews. Some of you listen to that as well. But back to the national level, health and scientific literacy is lower than it should be, and the agency whose task it is to dispel misinformation had their hands tied. As a result, there was rampant misinformation. Let's hope we don't have to face that situation again. I've heard a lot of concern, even from people in my own family, about the complexity of CDC public guidance. Public health protection messages have to be adjusted to the audience. We have a lot of different audiences in the US and certainly globally. Recommendations for healthcare workers are different than for nursing homes or for office environments. I'm a little bit concerned that we may have a national attention deficit disorder. Disagreement is normal. Answers to complex questions are unfortunately not always short. I know that you know this already, but I'm concerned that the patience level of the general population is diminished, helped along by social media possibly, and the instantly available internet in general. They can find any answer to any question instantly. You read what comes up in your Google search and you think you've answered the question, but in matters of public policy, particularly in COVID, there aren't any fast, easy answers. Data collected during a national emergency may cause recommendations to quickly evolve. That doesn't mean that the initial recommendations were wrong. I loved a recently published article in the New York Times in their series about the pandemic where they asked a group of experts the same question and looked at their answers. So the scenario that they laid out was an early viral infection, only 10 patients so far, but this hypothetical virus was more deadly than COVID-19. So the first question is whether schools should be closed. Expert number one said no. Expert number two said yes. About a mask mandate, guess what? One expert said yes, and one expert said no. The next question was about an international travel ban. The experts also disagreed on this one. Now, as a former frequent global traveler, it worries me a lot that even this component of the response is still subject to a lot of disagreement. In my view, travel bans can be economically devastating and cause enormous hardship for families, yet in certain circumstances, they can substantially slow infectious disease progress in an emergency. Finally, there was a topic on which all the experts agreed: vaccine mandates. Vaccine mandates work, but they must be designed carefully with exemptions. The effectiveness of vaccine mandates and how to best design them, for example, with increased testing for people who have a valid reason for an exemption, seems to be one of the subjects where COVID-19 has provided at least a modicum of consensus among experts, and I'm grateful for that. I want to turn now to some positive, hopeful points, since this has been a lot of negative conflict that I've talked about. First of all, the pandemic could have been a lot worse. Plague in 1894 caused 12 deaths around the world. The 1918 flu pandemic caused 50 million deaths. Modern medicines and management and rapidly uh, produced vaccines saved us from what could have been a far worse fate. Secondly, current immunity. University of Washington scientists estimated that as of mid-December 2022, more than 97% of people worldwide have some level of immunity from infection or vaccination or a combination. And that's why many of you are not wearing masks. Thirdly, the challenges of the pandemic have resulted in the clinical trial ecosystem to make some positive advances. So, more good news. COVID had a profound impact on drug development as the medical care system battened down the hatches to prevent viral spread. A lot of clinical trials around the world had to be stopped because the hospitals were closed, the doctor's offices were closed, and the patients couldn't be monitored. So there was a sudden infusion of innovation to keep trials going with fewer in-person visits. This resulted in like a leapfrogging of progress about remotely monitoring patients in clinical trials, which hopefully will stay with drug development as we move forward. The advances in clinical trial conduct that occurred as a result of the pandemic are still being digested, and I hope many of the elements of progress continue. COVID also spurred some advances in drug regulation, and there may be some drug regulators listening here. Imperative to rapidly develop antiviral vaccines and drugs put enormous pressure on regulators around the world. And what the result was some new practices around enhanced emergency procedures that shortened approval times to get drugs and vaccines and devices to patients faster. Hopefully, those advances will continue into the future. Regulatory reliance is a concept where one regulator will accept the work of another regulator rather than requiring separate medical products country. And this has been a thorn in the side of people that develop drugs for a long time. And I think regulators are working at an enhanced pace on this kind of reliance activity, which is very positive. Recently, Bill Gates authored a New York Times op-ed which called for a global system of pandemic responders who are ready for a crisis. And I can't disagree with this at all. In the United States, the Commission for the Public Health Service is already configured to serve this purpose. And the needs of a system like this exist in other parts of the world, but they're not tied together. And they do not have a consistent set of comprehensive pandemic processes to allow effective coordination. And of course, the elephant in the room is as comprehensive, as well-funded, and coordinated as such a future system is, it can always be undone by poor executive leadership at the top of any country. And of course, we're not alone in the world on this issue. The reluctance of certain countries to openly share information about the pandemic will continue to be a thorn in the side of people trying to track the pandemic. It can also be a problem in the future as well. So this brings me back around to KGI and some closing remarks so I can have time for you all to ask some questions. And I want to leave you on a hopeful note. The answers to many of society's problems will only come with investments in scientific research, private and public, and improved investments in the scientific workforce that the US can produce. Overall, scientific arrogance is fatal. There are always multiple ways of looking at problems, and believing that yours or ours is the only valid one is a recipe for bad decision making. Good scientists look at multiple perspectives carefully before coming down hard on their view. There will always be tensions. There will not be one path forward that's always best for both rich countries and less rich countries. Perhaps in the future we'll have a more egalitarian utopia, but I don't see that happening in my lifetime or the lifetime of my offspring. So, in case you're already not aware of this, we can't see the future. As scientists, we know this intuitively, uncomfortable, but from fortune tellers in that mysterious corner store that you sometimes drive by, to financial analysts who try to convince people they figured out how to predict future economic trends. We're so unsettled by the fact that we can't see the future that sometimes we suspend our better judgment to believe poorly supported predictions because they make us feel better. This is a cognitive trap, and it stops us from doing what we should to prepare for an uncertain future. The scientific method, when well applied, does allow us to make probabilistic predictions about future things such as climate change, although even something like climate change, we can't be super precise. The idea that billions invested in Miami shoreline real estate may be lost in future sea level rise is deeply unsettling, but it's still happening. In public health, there's broad agreement that public health agencies from CDC to FDA to state and local health departments have been underfunded. My hope is that these millions of deaths around the world will stimulate more robust funding and authorities to combat a future repeat with an even worse viral foe. It's probably coming, we just don't know when. To do this effectively, we need strength and speed and organizational competence. We have an incredible opportunity over the next few years to learn from our mistakes and to regroup. Each of the many levels of government, private enterprise, Congress, the judiciary, school districts, universities and families have a role to play. But as I mentioned earlier, we have to push back against concerted efforts to undermine science-based decision making. How can I possibly remain optimistic? And I am, in the face of all the issues we discussed today, for the health and scientific literacy deficits that we can readily agree plague us and other countries. Know this: one effective treatment available is training and education. We need a new generation of product developers, manufacturers, a public health workforce, mental health experts, and many, many others to succeed against the next pandemic. Institutions like KGI play a key role in helping create the next generation of scientists and leaders to apply cutting edge science to the problems of pandemic preparedness, medical product development, and scientific literacy. To the students The faculty and institutional supporters listening to me today, we may not be able to see the future, but we can control its consequences and work together towards a more healthy and equitable world, towards a future where sickness and disease are better controlled so that our citizens can live as full a lives as possible. This institution has made remarkable progress in its brief quarter of a century, and it's poised to do even more. Congratulations on being part of this first quarter century, and thank you very much for listening today. We have time for questions? Okay, you want me to stand here? Okay.
Yeah, we do have time for questions, and remember, if there are no questions, we know where we're
He
going.
didn't leave
He
yet, so-
didn't make a run for it. Mary, go ahead.
Mary Vessel. I'm a second year MSMD student, medical device engineering. I have a difficult question.
Okay.
So the 1918 flu pandemic, 50 million people in the world were infected and 50 million people died. We didn't learn from that. What makes you think we're going to learn from COVID? And why wasn't that factored in to making the predictive models for our protection stronger and better? You're talking about the same order of magnitude.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk another hour to give you more specific things, but answers to that. But you're right, and it's difficult for me to say we didn't learn anything because our medical system has advanced so much. How we care for patients, our understanding of how diseases spread, and so I do think we've learned a lot. And it would, if we had the healthcare system and the vaccines and the drugs of 1918, a lot more people would have died. So I think we did learn, but the the thing about these viruses is they've evolved a lot longer than we have, and they know how to outsmart us even when we're prepared. So I don't think that any amount of preparation we do will completely eliminate the chance of dying because of the pandemic, but it will certainly reduce it.
Saying that because we were so ready, as ready as we were, even though that clearly fell short.
No, we weren't ready. Yeah, but yeah.
Have we not learned from past pandemics? You're talking about events.
Yeah, I think we have learned, but the message I'm trying to convey is we need to continue learning and continue improving our preparation because we didn't do well enough. You know, we should have had fewer deaths in the U.S. and around the world. Yay!
This is
The threats work.
this is a preemptive strike. Staying here. Back to the now. So nice talk, very nice talk. But do you think we have enough preparations for a future or something? Like you mentioned about multiple occasions where this can come, like a biological attack or radioactive thing that comes our way. Do you think we have enough stockpiles? You know, in terms
No,
of
I think we have to continually struggle to be better prepared. We will never be completely prepared, but if we're not actively working on it continuously, we know that it will be worse than nothing. So I don't think we're ready for everything, but we're ready for certain things. Yeah.
So you mentioned that you find it hard to understand why there are certain groups in the U.S. that don't trust medical science or science in
I
general.
didn't say I find it hard to understand. It's the fact.
What I'm wondering
Yeah.
is, what would be your
Yes.
trust in medical science?
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
You know, you all in this room probably have as many ideas, and they might be as good or better than my ideas. You know, continuing to try to explain things, have scientists and experts explain things in a way that people can understand, not using technical jargon and explaining consequences of their actions. I don't know what else to do. It's very, very challenging.
Yeah, so kind of, I feel like I'm piggybacking on some of these questions coming after you, but you mentioned scientists uh, needing to be the ones with the microphone in sort of communication. So now I'm microphone, but the idea of having politicians be the ones calling the shots in this scenario, of course, had some implication on this problem. However, supply chains are very complicated. And these things connect country to country, state to state, city to city. And having that be integrated, that is not a problem for the scientists to solve. That's a problem for the politicians, the business people to solve. So, from coming from KGI, of course, we have the MBS students. That's what we want to coax into this area. But how do we scientists come to connect and build that relationship in a healthy way where the influence is actually
I think I'm so glad you asked that because so many scientists and physicians and engineers, they're so fed up with politics that they don't want to get involved at all. Unfortunately, the only way to address this is for scientists, physicians, engineers to engage politicians, to go up on Capitol Hill when there's an opportunity, educate the staff, talk to the members, talk to your own member of Congress wherever you live, write letters, get involved with public affairs and politics. And I'm not pointing to you at all. Don't hide in your behind your lab benches and your offices and your computer screens. You have to be out there engaging, and it's uncomfortable for a lot of people in science to do that. But I think that's the only way to address it.
I think we have time for two more questions. I think the two over here.
Yes.
So, can we hear it?
Yes, thank you very much for your question that I've been pondering recently, and I think you touched on it, is that science is dealing with probability, not certainty. Now, how do we re-educate the public so they're not expecting the God doctor to make an announcement for it to be always true? It also on the Dr. Fauci brouhaha.
Well, let me do that in reverse order. I worked with Dr. Fauci. He's a great person, and I think he played an amazing role. I don't understand the criticism against him, frankly, so I don't know how to address it. The question you're asking about how do you explain probabilities versus a fact, this is what I was talking about in terms of the attention deficit of the public. People want to type in something in their search bar and get one answer. They don't want to hear about probabilities. But whenever I talk to people, members of my family or friends, I try to explain, this is more likely, that's less likely. And as scientists, we just have to try to explain things simply. And again, I think that's the only way to address that problem. There is no one solution to that. There isn't. Yeah, we just have to engage.
I'm Monica Chan original from Stony Brook. That's
Oh,
why I want to ask a question.
okay, great.
Today
Go
is
Stony Brook.
already the co-sponsored Stony Brook alumni. Anyway, I was in that at Stony Brook in economics. Finally, I graduated from Columbia in the economics department. I have taught for many years. I'm about your cohort.
Oh, great.
My question is, you answered one of my questions. I have three vaccines, but I was hesitant to have the booster because I learned from other people. They say even the Pfizer, that pharmaceutical company has data. I do not know whether it's true or not, saying that it's no good for a lot of people who had the vaccine. If you can elaborate this.
Well, one of the things I did to prepare for this is to look into that data, and the one of the graphical slides of this last graphical slide that I showed was data from CDC. It didn't separate out the Moderna from the Pfizer uh, updated booster, but data has been collected comparing the serious illness and death rates in people who've had the updated booster versus the people who haven't. And the updated booster reduces your risk of serious illness and death. So again, I don't know where that particular thing you heard comes from, but when you look at the data combined, naturally, that's what it shows.
One more.
I don't know if it's loud enough, but my name is Karina. I'm a second year MSCM student, and I think you did a great job of addressing a very complicated topic. You've given a lot of information that is very inspiring, and I thank you for that. I think maybe a more specific concern that I have in regards to future pandemic responses is our healthcare delivery system. And I wanted to know what your perspective is in are we ever going to get universal health care? Are we ever going to recognize healthcare as a human right? Is that still a story, or is that a fairy tale?
Well, I don't know. Let me turn it back to you. It's going to be up to your generation to try to advocate for a better healthcare system serving every American than we have now. I think it will be a continuing struggle, whether we will succeed in that particular universal health care that you're implying. I don't know, but I certainly hope we will continue to work towards that.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Galson one more time for a fabulous and stimulating discussion. Really was wonderful. And I'd like to invite everyone to the reception in the Chan Family Cafe. And I just want you to know that my first question to Dr. Galson is going to be about the zombie apocalypse with fungi, because we all watched The Last of Us and we want to know the answer to that one. Please join us in the cafe, and thank you all. And Dr. Galson.